Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Welcome to our June 2020 Electric Power webinar. We will be now waiting for a couple of minutes to allow everybody who registered to sign in. So please stay with us for a few minutes. Good morning, everyone. My name is Cesar Iliano. I'm Content Director for BNamericas. I see there's a crowd there. That's good to see. Welcome to our BNamericas Electric Power Webinar 2020. As you may already know, BNamericas tracks the CapEx trends in several industries in Latin America. This webinar will discuss those trends among the most important electric power companies operating in the region. Then we will be interviewing Mauricio Bezzeccheri, Head of Latin America at Enel. We'd like to remind all participants that they are in listen-only mode. All the questions that you want to ask may be submitted at any time using the chat function on the right side of the screen. Our energy team will be keeping an eye on those questions coming in throughout the webinar, and we'll try to answer all of them at the end in our Q&A session. So let's start. Please let me introduce you to Michael Pace, our regional energy editor based in Medellin, Colombia, and Cristobal Riego, our Southern Cone energy correspondent based in Santiago de Chile. How are you guys?
Good morning, Cesar. Good morning to all of our attendees. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Morning, Cesar. Morning, Mike, and everyone. Thanks for inviting us, and I hope you're having a nice morning.
Okay, so Cristobal will be starting showing you some figures for the top 10 companies in the region. So, Cristobal, it's all yours.
Thanks, Cesar. So, In the last few weeks, as you may have seen, the BNamericas editorial team has been conducting different webinars showing how hard the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting the mining and oil and gas industry since the beginning of the year. And if you saw those presentations, basically our conclusions were that the impacts has been quite stark. But when we turn to analyze the similar numbers for the power industry, the outlook looks actually quite different from those other two. So for this presentation, we selected 10 major companies with interest in Latin America to see what their announced CapEx plans were, and found out that capital expenditure will actually increase by 11% when compared to 2019. Many of the companies said, of course, that they will stay flexible this year with their investments and focus on their most critical projects. And of course, the evolution of the situation can change things quite dramatically, as we have seen in other industries. But many of them initially stuck to their investment guidelines from before the crisis, and one of them even increased it. So the global numbers shows the realized 2019 capex for these 10 companies was $25.2 billion, and the forecast for 2020 for those same companies is now $28 billion instead. So later in the presentation, Michael will be going into more details about the kinds of investments these companies will focus during the year. This chart that should be appearing now shows the latest capex forecast for the 10 selected companies. Some of the numbers are exclusive to Latin America and some are global. But the general trend shows 7 out of the 10 companies are planning to invest more this year compared to 2019. And now I'll hand things over to Michael, who has some highlights on the capex plans for some of these companies.
Thank you very much, Chris. We'll start by looking at Iberdrola, which expects 2020 capex to reach $10.9 billion US. Now, the company continues to make Mexico and Brazil its main priorities in Latin America. In Mexico, Iberdrola has begun construction work on the 274 megawatt Coyoaco solar plant in the state of Puebla, with the first PV modules having already been installed. In Brazil, the company is continuing work on the 472 megawatt Chafariz wind complex in the state of Paraíba, which is expected to be commissioned in early 2022. In addition, Iberdrola is building 12 wind farms in the state of Piauí, totaling 566 megawatts, with construction scheduled for completion in the latter half of 2022. The next company is AES, which expects 2020 capex of $2.98 billion, up from $2.4 billion last year. The company has a 6.1 gigawatt backlog, mostly comprised of solar and wind projects. Around half of this pipeline is comprised of projects already in construction. AES has used $335 million US in equity to fund growth in AES Gena, which has a $1.8 billion US renewable growth plan in Chile and also in Colombia. Meanwhile, its Salvadorian subsidiary AES El Salvador expects to invest $36 million US this year. The Brazilian arm, AES Tietê, anticipates a capital outlay of 1.4 billion reais, which is $280 million US at the current exchange rate, between 2020 and 2024. Now, much of this will be pumped into its Tucano wind project, and for 2020, Tietê's expectation is to invest $50 million US compared to $57.5 million last year. Now, Interconexión Eléctrica, otherwise known as ISA, based in Colombia, expects to invest $1.84 billion US in its Latin American businesses this year, compared to $1.43 billion projected in its previous update, which was in November. The company reported 2019 capital expenditure of 2.6 trillion pesos, which is around $800 million US for 2019. Obviously, late last year, the company's Brazilian unit, ISA STEEP, acquired 3 grid connection projects in the states of São Paulo, Rio Grande do Sul, and Minas Gerais. In its Q1 earnings call, executives said that ISA plans to participate in upcoming Colombian transmission tenders as a stakeholder, but it bemoaned competition laws that prevent the company from acquiring new assets outright. Now on to Enel, which in 2020 has estimated capex of $1.79 billion US. The company has said that it doesn't expect the coronavirus pandemic to impact its capex plans. The group's current pipeline includes the 716 megawatt Lagoa dos Ventos complex in Brazil, which is Latin America's biggest wind project. It also comprises the 608 megawatt São Gonçalo project in Brazil, which will be the region's largest solar facility. Back to Colombia with EPM, which has an estimated 220 investment of $1.2 billion US, up from around $900 million US in 2019. The Medellin-based company has not readjusted its spending forecast as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. EPM said its 2020 investment outlay would be directed toward power generation, transmission, and distribution assets, in addition to water and waste initiatives. Its flagship project is the 2.4 gigawatt Hidroituango plant being built on the Cauca River in Colombia's northwestern department of Antioquia. In March, EPM was given regulatory approval to resume construction work at the site, almost 2 years after being ordered to halt the project amid safety and environmental concerns. Initially budgeted at around $3.5 billion US, the cost of the project, according to BNamericas estimates, is now around $4.5 billion US. Meanwhile, EPM made a winning bid for the Caribe Mar unit of Caribbean region electricity distributor Electric Caribe. The company's obligations include a requirement to invest around $1 billion US over the next 5 years to improve existing infrastructure. In investment news regarding other companies profiled, Brazil's state power holding company Eletrobras has reiterated plans to launch a tender for a contract to restart construction work on the Angra 3 nuclear plant before the end of 2020. The company's Eletronuclear subsidiary is currently working on a plan to fast-track machinery installation work. According to the latest estimates, the plant is expected to be operational by November 2026. In Mexico, IEnova is expected to make a final investment decision in the coming weeks for its Energía Costa Azul liquefied natural gas export project in Mexico's Baja California state. IEnova executives have said that a decision hinges on the approval of an export license. Now, the CEO of the company, Tania Ortiz, said that permitting processes for Costa Azul and other projects have been slowed in recent months, and conceded that capital spending might also be delayed because of COVID-19. And back in Brazil, ENGIE plans to invest around $500 million US to build the Novo Estado transmission line, which spans 1,800 kilometers, and which it acquired from India's Sterlite Power in March. The line has 30-year contracts awarded at an auction in 2017 and is due to begin operating in March 2023. Elsewhere in Brazil, ENGIE is building the 1,000-kilometer Gralha Azul transmission line, which will require an investment of around $400 million US. And it is also working on the second phase of its 360-megawatt Campo Largo wind project in Bahia State, which is due to come online next year. With that, I'll pass it back to Cesar.
Thank you very much, Mike, for the update. We also wanted to use the webinar to show you some of the findings in our last data report for electric power, a report that was built with exclusive information of our database of over 17,000 projects in the region. And so the electric power data report showed that the 10 power groups with the largest amount of active projects in the region will be adding 40 gigawatts of capacity over the next 5 years. And when you look at the pie that we are showing, you'll see that even without taking into consideration the hydro projects, almost half of our capacity is coming from renewable energy sources. And when you take a look at the distribution by countries, you'll see that in the pipeline of these 10 biggest operators, Brazil leads the way in wind power with 3.3 gigawatts of projects due to come online by 2024. And in solar power, Mexico takes the first spot with 4.3 gigawatts of new projects due to come online by that year. So now I will leave you back again with Chris and Mike. They will be walking you through the concrete impacts of COVID-19 in the industry in Latin America. Chris?
Thanks, Cesar. So basically, on average, power demand in the region has showed a decrease of around 10% in the last few months. Experts believe demand should bottom out in the second quarter as some countries begin to reopen their economies. Of course, that may change now with what we are seeing in terms of the rising number of cases in several countries in the region. According to Olade, across all of Latin America and the Caribbean, energy consumption is projected to fall 9% year on year. The pandemic has also affected the calendar of some projects in construction. Of course, this will vary by country, and the ensuing economic crisis as a consequence of the pandemic and the lockdown measures will deteriorate the credit quality of all or most Latin American sovereigns, which we are already seeing, making it in turn more difficult to finance projects across the region. However, some nations are also making renewable expansion a core part of their economic recovery plans. Since many countries in the region have ambitious renewable and climate goals, nations are likely to open financing lines and otherwise try to maintain momentum in the sector. This also involves the involvement of multilateral organizations, which also have a mandate and interest in spurring renewable growth in particular. The industry's long-term nature, focus on long-term PPAs, has made electric power more resilient than infrastructure and oil and gas to the impact of the pandemic. However, the ongoing economic crisis threatens to deteriorate regulatory stability in several countries as pressure mounts on governments to help citizens with the burden of public utility payments, which of course in a time of crisis, this issue becomes strained. So in Peru, expects power demand to contract by 4.7% this year. Previous guidance was minus 0.1%. In April, generation fell 30% to around 3,000 gigawatt hours year on year. So with thermoelectric production, nearly all of it natural gas, down 89%. So that's a very significant drop. Chile has seen power demand drop by an average of 5% in mid-March. These numbers are from April. So we must take into account the fact that since then, Chile has gone into a stricter lockdown, so we may see a different impact going forward. Demand in Chile's national system dropped by about 10 gigawatt hours per day since March 15. And before the pandemic, demand was between 190 and 220 gigawatt hours per day, just to give you an idea. The Senate also approved a bill that forbids public utility providers, so that's electric power, natural gas, water, and internet, from cutting off access to basic services during the COVID-19 pandemic. It also allows users among the 60% most vulnerable families to defer the payments of their utility bills for up to 12 months. And the future of this bill is still in question. The government may step in and use veto powers to adapt it or force it back into Congress. That remains to be seen. In neighbor Argentina, power demand during April presented a decrease of 11.5%. This is bigger than Chile because Argentina adopted stricter lockdown measures compared to the same period of the previous year, reflecting the lower activity of industrial and commercial users. Argentina also passed a resolution forbidding utility companies from cutting off vulnerable users. This was through a decree, not through a law like in Chile. In practice, this caused collection by distributors to fall sharply, and this, of course, threatens the industry's chain of payments. We have seen a lot of concerns of whether this will involve the government having to increase subsidies very significantly to keep wholesale market administrator Camesa, which is the company that manages payments in the power sector, from basically to keep it afloat in this new scenario. And now I'm going to pass it back to Michael so he can give you the outlook on Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia.
Looks like Michael's not there. Are you there, Michael?
Sorry, I think I was in mute. My apologies. My apologies all. I'd just like to remind all of our attendees that you can submit questions at any time using the control panel, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll, of course, endeavour to answer all of those in the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So on to Brazil. Brazil's electricity demand is expected to fall 5% in June compared with the same month in 2019. National Grid Operator ONS has said it expects consumption to continue to be impacted in the coming months. Distributors in Brazil are being hit particularly hard by the crisis. The government's financial bailout package for distribution companies affected by liquidity issues is forecast to exceed $3 billion. The so-called COVID account will help distributors deal with the problems of energy oversupply and the mass non-payment of bills, with consumers being protected by judicial rulings preventing services from being cut. The government fears that distributors could face serious liquidity problems, which would have dire consequences for the rest of the energy sector, including transmission and generation companies. At least 3 distributors that we've reported, Light, Equatorial Energia, and Enel, have already tried to renegotiate supply contracts with generators using force majeure clauses. Brazil's largest private generator, Engie, has already received some requests for load revisions. In Mexico, we saw April demand decrease by about 7% year on year. By the end of May, load was down by about 12% compared to the same time in 2019. There are expectations that this trend will continue in the coming months, placing a further financial strain on state-controlled distributor CFE. Now, we've also seen a very substantial controversy play out in Mexico regarding the dispatch priority of renewables and their ability to enter operations during the health crisis. Mexico has vowed to continue a legal fight over Sena's controversial reliability policy, rolled out under the argument that energy security is more important than economic efficiency. On Friday, Sena suffered a new setback to its arguments when a court ruling granted a permanent injunction on the policy, which is the latest in a series of legal wins for owners of renewable energy plants. With Sena's decision to fight this ruling, this discussion is far from over, and we expect more news on the legal and regulatory standoff in the coming weeks. In Colombia, low rainfall has meant that electricity spot prices have not fallen despite the drop in consumption caused by the quarantine. That has also brought financial stress to distributors. Now, power demand in Colombia fell by an estimated 15 to 20% in the first month of the lockdown. However, we've seen consumption rebound by up to 10 percentage points since parts of the economy began to reopen in late April. In further good news for the sector, the government has offered low-interest financing packages to help utilities get through the crisis. And that includes distributors, generators, and also transmission operators. So with that, I'll pass it back to Cesar.
Thank you very much. There was a delay here, Mike. Now we will listen to Mauricio Bezzeccheri and his vision on what's next in the electric power industry in this scenario. So please, let's listen to him. Albert? Good afternoon, Mauricio. Thank you for being with us today for this conversation about the electric power industry here in Latin America. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you. We are busy, quite busy, but we are running in a safe way our business in the region.
So, of course, one of the topics I wanted to mention in this conversation is the transition to clean energy, clean energies in Latin America amid this scenario of crisis and pandemic. And I know Enel has given a very strong signal a couple of weeks ago when the company announced that the early decommissioning of Bocamina 1, Bocamina 2. So it looks like for Enel, the transition is still going at full speed. But still, I just wanted to ask you, do you feel that the pandemic will impact in any way the speed of the transition at Enel?
In general, let's say that pandemic has got a dramatic impact on the existing social and economic system, with dramatic impact in terms of debt and economy slowdown. But even more dramatic will be if we will not take advantages by lesson learned during COVID period. One of the trend already in place in the energy transition was, for example, the decarbonization. And this is the reason why we accelerate the decarbonization decision. We anticipated with the closing of the announcement of closing of Bocamina, let's say the shutdown of coal power plant by almost 20 years, because we got an agreement with the Chilean government last year, and we were supposed to close the Bocamina 2 power plant in 2040. So we decided to accelerate, because this is one of the lessons learned by coronavirus, that we need to accelerate or to continue accelerating the energy transition phase. For this reason, already before, and we will continue, speeding up the introduction of renewable energy in the energy matrix of Latin America. Let's say that we have already 5,000 megawatt already approved. Some is already in construction, some other will start soon construction. And we will get this new 5,000 megawatt by 2022. Then we have a strong pipeline with 17,000 megawatt of new renewable project running. And we prioritize the solution related to solar and wind power plant. And why? Because the sustainability of the system is demonstrated in terms of generation by the renewable energy. They are cheaper in terms of price. They are safe from the environmental point of view, and they establish a more safe relationship with the local community. So all this reason will push us to continue our growth. Yes.
And when you think of the electric power industry as a whole, what would you say companies taking decisions in the next 1 or 2 years, what will be different after the pandemic in the way they decide what projects to go with or how to invest?
The major difference will be the speed. Energy transition, as you said, already was in place previously, the COVID phase. And now we will see in the energy transition the needs to speed up the process related to energy transition. The three major pillars of energy transition is digitalization, is electrification, is decentralization. That's decentralization because you will have for sure more, let's say, distributed energy and distributed storage. In terms of electrification, of course, we strongly believe that electrification is the more efficient way to generate an energy vector. And for example, already we started with electrification in terms of mobility. We started the project related to electric buses in Chile. We continue in Colombia. We continue now in Peru or in Brazil. So, and regarding digitalization, you need to think about digitalization of the grid and digitalization of the power plant. In the reality, Enel already put in May last year all its system in cloud. And the fact that we were able just to put in cloud, this allowed us to be more resilient during this period. Why? Because we were able to duplicate control room very, very quickly. We were able just to control our power plant in a remote way. And in the reality, what we did, we put 50% of our workforce and our contractor in smart working. Yeah. And all this stuff has been possible only thanks to digitalization.
Of course, I know how important it is for Enel and for many major companies, the ESG factors, but would you say after this pandemic, will it become more difficult to comply with these ESG factors to get financing or to be able to go ahead?
No. Personally, I think that ESG is even more relevant every day, and stakeholders are demanding much more in this sense. We design our business plan in agreement with the SDGs of United Nations. In the reality, the major driver of our business plan before pandemic and even more now after pandemic with the new normal will be mostly related to the SDG number 7, 9, 11, and 13 that are related to new city, digitalization of the city with new possibility of CO2 emission reduction with more safe energy availability. So we strongly believe that in the last year we have seen how ESG has evolved and become one of the most important factors for our decision-making process within company and also for investors. For sure, in the future, we will see new dimension and stricter measures in line with needs of our society.
And in those lines, we already talk about decarbonization, but what other kind of projects would you say we will be seeing less and less in the company's pipeline?
Personally, in line with the energy transition and with the needs that we have mentioned before, the digitalization, electrification, and the decentralization, we will see less and less projects with a big environmental impact. Carbon plants, big hydro dams, not more in line with the projection of energy demand, shouldn't be part of the company pipelines.
And it doesn't look like you think that way, but just in case, do you think that this maybe this somehow slowdown in investment in these years because of the pandemic can put at risk the Latin America getting to the clean energy targets that were set like last year?
No, we are confident that this situation, first of all, will be a temporary situation, will not stay for longer, and that as soon as it's over, we will return to our normal scenario. So we don't see any major impact.
And in terms of costs, would you say that the projects that are being built this year or next year will have some impact on costs?
No, the business model, for example, in renewable energy, is a quite resilient business model. We have modulate or remodulate our supply chain in such a way we will keep and maintain on budget and on time our project. Of course, you need to build up a resilient supply chain, and this is the way in which we are sure that no major cost will impact on our project development.
And talking about the industry in general, not only in Enel, do you feel that other companies that have in their pipelines projects in very early stages will be forced to freeze them and to wait and see?
No, of course, we see that pandemic is put a strong pressure on infrastructure needs, and so we expect that in Latin America, one of the lessons learned, we need to speed up in terms of infrastructure. For example, in terms of healthcare investment, we think that it would be necessary to speed up investment in this sense. Why? Because we have seen how important is the general health situation of the population in terms of economic impact, in terms of industry dynamics, because we have seen some mining industry just shut down because there was a strong diffusion of contaminated people. So I think that the infrastructure is the key element for and the big opportunity for Latin America in general. And of course, here is correct to mention the fact that let's say we need to put more attention due to the informality of the work in Latin America, in some country with a very high percentage. We need to think about effort on education, for example, because we need just to reskill the people, making the system more resilient.
Okay. Great, Maurizio. Thank you very much for your time with us today. I hope this crisis ends soon and we all go back to normal as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Yeah, new normal is, we hope that new normal is around the corner.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Well, as you may have heard, the taker is not expecting the end of the world here, so he sees the energy transition in the region to keep running as fast as it was running before. But of course, we know that many of you are worried about the short term, and we can see that in some of the questions that you posted during the webinar. So our energy team is looking at the questions that you posted. I don't know if we are ready, Mike, to start, but whenever you are, we can start with a Q&A session.
Thanks, Cesar. We have a question regarding Chile. What can Chilean regulators and authorities do to maintain the pace of renewable investment? I believe my colleague Chris can answer that question. Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So this is, of course, a very multifaceted issue. So I'm going to try to go over some of the aspects. So, of course, for a start, the government can help companies find affordable credit through incentive plans and credit plans. For example, last week we had such a plan announced by Corfo for small projects. It set apart $39 million to help green companies, and especially companies constructing small generation assets and small generation assets with a storage component. So we expect to see other sort of credit lines also aimed at big companies to help them maintain liquidity in this time. Then you have another issue of red tape. So since the pandemic is forcing a lot of delays in many areas, I think it brings into focus the fact approval of projects and other red tape issues are quite slow and slow down the process even more. So I think the government should try, and has said it will try, to help projects get approved faster by environmental authorities. And also, the Energy Ministry will try to encourage and pressure Congress to discuss some essential projects that have been stuck in congressional limbo for years in certain cases. So the flexibility bill, the second distribution bill, and other bills. Those could be passed much faster. They are mostly bipartisan in nature. I'm sure there will be some debates, but and those could give a very positive signal to the sector and help certain areas such as energy storage, which will be very important in the coming years, to move at a faster clip and to incentivize those investments. Of course, the big issue in Chile in this pandemic will be, I think, regulatory stability. So the government has been forced to give some difficult signals after the social crisis of last year, which saw widespread riots and protests, as I'm sure you know. The government issued a stabilization fund and froze the price of electric power. And then we have this new law passed by Congress that forbids companies from cutting access to certain utilities for non-paying customers. I think the government can do a lot on this front to assuage the concerns of companies by making sure the kinds of issues like this don't become commonplace, and also by making sure these two bills are resolved in a reasonable and quick manner. I think the deterioration of regulatory stability could be very hurtful for Chile, because since it is a small market, regulatory stability is one of its biggest assets for sure, and is the main reason, one of the main reasons that attracts investors to this country. But I think the authorities are very conscious of the fact that this is a key issue, and they will have to manage, I think, a very delicate balancing act, because with the pandemic and the economic effects, you will have these problems with prices being exacerbated. People will have less spending power, and so the high cost of living will become more of an issue. And I think the government will have to walk a thin line there, and strike a difficult but possible balance between the expectations of its citizens and those of private players who are investing and helping the economic recovery. That's that question, Mike. Do you have any others?
Thanks for that, Chris. We have a question that came in earlier regarding Mexico. Where does the current dispute between Mexican energy officials and the private renewables industry in Mexico stand now that a federal judge has placed a permanent injunction on this controversial reliability policy? Now, my colleague James Young in Mexico City has sent me a quick response. Thanks very much, James. He says that the short answer to this is that the matter is far from settled. The Energy Ministry has already said that it will fight the ruling. Theoretically, with the solar and wind projects that are ready to come online, there is a window here to run those tests. But you have to understand that this requires participation from the grid operator, COFECE. And he says that he would be surprised to see any new project come online while the appeals process continues. A very possible outcome here is that the government will eventually have its way, gaining more control over the wholesale electricity market in exchange for some small concessions. But ultimately, we see this more as the government's longer game to assert its dominance, where private players should be glad the outcome isn't worse. Andrés Manuel López Obrador is not some kind of evil warlord, even though some people might think that he is. In order for him to achieve his long-term goals, he realises that he must assert the dominance of Pemex and state-owned power company CFE in their respective markets. He needs to know that private players are not going to put up resistance as he attempts to reshape the energy sector. Thanks very much, James. Now we have another question regarding Mexico, which I believe our Mexican team has also been able to respond to. I'll let Chris respond to that question. Chris.
Okay, this answer was also provided to us by our colleague James Young. So, do you have any recommendations to our clients and contractors on how to navigate the situation in Mexico? Are there going to be opportunities? And the answer is there will be opportunities, certainly for service contracts, for equipment suppliers, engineering suppliers, logistics, etc. But if you're looking to be a generator first, there may be no new permits until this current issue fully resolves. Until then, you might do well to seek the blessing of the administration before moving forward. It would not surprise me to see any concessions or contracts coming out of this administration going to companies that came first to the López Obrador administration and asks how they can be a part of the fourth transformation. That's what he calls his master plan for the country, the fourth transformation. So I'm seeing, Michael, we also have a question about Argentina. I'm going to answer it now. So we have, just 1 second, please. The question. So what investment do you see for utilities in Argentina energy market? Will gas continue to lead the energy matrix in the future? So I think this is a very interesting issue. On the one hand, we have the uncontrovertible fact that Argentina has world-class renewable resources, especially wind resources. But sadly, and we saw a quite impressive growth in renewable investments in the last 3 years, around three years. The issue is we see this becoming temporarily, winding down temporarily for many issues. The issue of the debt, the fact that financing conditions have deteriorated very strongly, the fact this administration is not very interested in, at least not in renewable development as it was being carried out before, with long-term dollarized contracts, with a lot of assurances for investors and financial institutions. So if they are going to have a renewable growth plan, we think it will look very different from the previous one, from the Renovar auctions. I think the government is interested in the kinds of projects that we have seen develop in other Kirchner's administration, so large scale, generally nuclear or hydroelectric or natural gas projects with a very high level of involvement from the government and from the provinces, with large investment amounts and big capacity. So once the outlook clears out a bit for Argentina, we expect these kind of projects to resurface and gain prominence again. Of course, gas will continue to play a key role in the matrix. It is Argentina's biggest generation asset. It has very strong access to very cheap gas. So we don't see that changing in the near future. But what technologies complement gas in the matrix, I think is going to be one of the themes of how this administration begins to roll out policy once it gets a little bit more leeway, because right now it is very focused only on the issue of the debt and then the issue of the pandemic, which of course that's taking up most of the administration's time and efforts.
Thank you, Chris. We have a question regarding Mexico's energy market. What is your expectation for developing natural gas projects for power generation and in regards to the major companies? My colleague, Sean Goforth in Mexico, has been very quick with his response here. He says that regarding natural gas, AMLO appears to have relented to US imports with a 2.6 billion cubic feet a day South Texas to expand pipeline coming online last September. It has handily filled out the skeleton of the country's gas network. He says that natural gas imports were originally scheduled to drive use of more expensive and dirtier fuel oils out of the market this year. But given the government support of Pemex, it looks like fuel oil will continue to be used in CFE power plants. Instead, the use of the pipelines looks set to replace LNG in the Mexican market. Thank you very much, Sean. We have a question regarding information on Central America. My colleague, David Casillas, has provided a response. Thank you, David. Central America is in the initial phase of energy transition with the ramp up of renewable energies to displace liquid fuel-fired plants and the incorporation of natural gas into the energy value chain. There have been slight delays in projects, but governments and stakeholders have pledged to continue this migration. Now, I'm just seeing if there are any other questions that have come in. Now, I believe we have a few other questions. We're just waiting for our reporters to get back to us.
Yeah, so we have a question about Chile, Mike, if you mind if I take that one.
Yep, sure, Chris, thanks.
So do you see potential for hybrid projects considering the growth of solar, wind project pipelines in Chile and for thermal storage? So I think the fact that Chile is advancing so fast towards a mostly renewable matrix. So right now we are around 20, a little bit more of the matrix in the first months of this year, and some experts expect to get to even to 70% in 10 years, so in 2030. Of course, the pace may change a little bit, but the thing is that the matrix will be mostly composed by renewables at some point in the first half of this decade, by most estimates. So the issue is what technologies will be best suited to complement those, because this generation will come mostly from solar and wind, and these are highly variable. So they only generate at certain points in the day when the resource is available. So what other technologies can slot in alongside those two? And I think some people are betting heavily on the idea that it will be energy storage. So these same solar or wind parks with a storage component that can store the energy that's not needed in certain times and then inject it in the times of the day when it is most necessary. But I think most agree that other thermal technologies will play a role in this transition between a fully renewable grid and what we have now, which is 40% coal, a share of renewable, non-conventional, a share of hydropower, and so most signs point towards natural gas because it is cleaner than coal, but has the same flexibility that coal plants offer, that they can generate whenever is needed, and they can be placed in areas where they don't congest the transmission lines that go from the solar resources in the north toward the south, where most of the demand is located. So I think we will see a role for natural gas plants, especially if Argentina can get out of this crisis and continue to grow its gas production, so imports can become more reliable. And we will also see, probably, depending on how fast costs come down, we will see a lot of storage projects and other sort of backup technologies, such as, for example, concentrated solar power, which is also very flexible, biomass plants, which are also very flexible, geothermal generation, which is also very flexible, and they are all clean, so they fit neatly with this idea of cleaning up the Chile's power grid. So I think all of these technologies will have a role to play here, and of course, they could be more or less a protagonist depending on cost and other regulation and other issues.
Thanks, Chris. We have a question about Peru. What regulatory measures would you advise to implement for boosting up growth of renewable energy in Peru? David Casellas has provided a response to that question. So he says there has been a call to remove additional barriers, such as that related to the calculation of firm capacity of renewable energies. There was some headway made recently related to wind, but not solar. A government-appointed commission tasked with power reform continues to work, but much of the work to date has focused on natural gas, specifically how generators declare pricing. He says that undoubtedly the drop of gas-fired generation amid the demand slide, as generation with low variable costs is dispatched first, will be taken into account by the Commission. And we're running out of time. I will just quickly respond to a Colombia question regarding considerable remaining coal reserves and falling demand for coal in key export geographies such as Europe, complicated by the oil price crash, and what will be the future given those circumstances on the coal segment in Colombia's electric power generation mix. The government has said that coal isn't a priority in its long-term vision. Obviously, the country held its first renewables auction last year, and it was a huge success. The government's really pushing renewable energy now, notably wind and solar power. The bridge, obviously, to that is natural gas, but there are huge concerns in Colombia about diminishing local natural gas reserves, and also the fact that there is only one LNG import facility at the moment. There is talk. There are plans for another facility to be built in Buenaventura on the Pacific coast. Now, I think it will depend on how quickly Colombia's natural gas import plans and also development plans from fracking and also from offshore development can progress. If Colombia cannot boost its natural gas reserves in the next 2 or 3 years, then coal will definitely continue to play an important role in the energy mix, as we're seeing now. I mean, coal is contributing to firm energy at the moment as we speak, especially given the low rainfall in Colombia over the last few months. So in the short to medium term, coal will have a role for firm energy, for backup energy, but in the long term, even with falling coal prices and falling demand in Europe, the Colombian government has clearly stated that it doesn't form part of its plans. So with that, I know there are more questions, and our apologies for not having time to respond. We've run out of time, so I'm going to pass it back to Cesar to wrap this up.
Yeah, just wanted to mention that we are still receiving some questions and we will be addressing them. Just on a final note, what you saw here is just a little bit of what we do every day with our energy team, giving insights, reports, analysis on projects. So if you like what you saw, just go into BNamericas.com, take a look at what else you can find there, and if you're interested, you can just ask for a demo right there. So again, thank you very much to all of you who've been listening to us in this webinar, and stay tuned. We will be announcing more webinars in the coming weeks. So thank you very much, all of you. Goodbye.